So let's talk about some of the foreign policy themes that were in play in 2012. I don't know if this was an important theme, but it certainly seemed to be an important moment. The Benghazi raids on the anniversary of 9/11, and then the campaign politics that erupted in response to that. That's one that still echoes today. Secretary Clinton is still being asked questions about that. So can you just talk to us what happened, not in Libya what happened, but what happened in the interplay of that event and the campaign dynamics?
Benghazi was an enormous issue, particularly among conservative voters. And when I would speak with Republican crowds, Benghazi was extraordinarily important to them. And there was a feeling that somehow Secretary Clinton had not just made a mistake, but maybe there was something more sinister than that. I didn't happen to agree that there had been a sinister purpose on her part, but of course she acknowledged that she was the person in charge and she didn't get the job done and she made a terrible mistake. And so I thought that the part of Benghazi that had the most political significance, if I was right in that regard, the most political significance was that the White House had tried to downplay Benghazi as a terrorist act and instead suggest it was a reaction to a videotape. And as you may recall from a debate, I tried to make that point, and Candy Crowley corrected me and said, no, that the president did that right. And I, to this day, disagree with her on that. Let's put it that way. And so that became an issue, although I happen to think that the overall foreign policy posture that the president represented in 2012 and continues to represent is at odds with the interests of America today. I think his foreign policy steps and his foreign policy pronouncements, even the things he said during the debate, when he, for instance, did not think that Russia was our geopolitical adversary. I mean, I find that to be an extraordinary admission and an extraordinary mistake in his part, which I thought should have been a bigger issue than it was during the campaign. I think the president's foreign policies have been disastrous for America and for the world. And if I look back again to the 2012 campaign, one of the things I was less successful in communicating than I'd like to have been was that we had very different foreign policies and that his foreign policy was not successful to that point and was unlikely to be successful.
You mentioned the Russia issue. That one is one where President Obama scored kind of a rhetorical victory in a sort. He had that crack, the 1980s are calling and they want their foreign policy, and that won on the Twitter competition of who was the funniest line of the night. Got a lot of mileage out of that. How does that look today, and how might you have responded then, and how would you respond now?
I think people have recognized that, in fact, the president was wrong as it related to Russia. We have Secretary Hillary Clinton, standing there with the Russian foreign minister, actually having produced a red button like the Staples "That's Easy" button. I mean, can you imagine a worse photo image than that? And it said reset, and she's pressing the reset button. It's like, are you kidding me? And this flowed. I used to joke that the president didn't have a foreign policy, but in fact he did. His foreign policy was based on the idea that the people of the world have common interests. I disagree. I think there are people in the world that seek to oppress other people and seek to take from other people their resources and their freedoms. And number two, he seemed to think that given the fact that everybody has common interests, that if we just show the people like Putin that we're willing to bend and provide him with various gifts politically, diplomatically they'd like, that he'll go along with us. That also has proved to be false. I mean, so this reset was, look, we're going to give you the #1 foreign policy objective that you guys have. The Russians across the table have as their #1 objective the removal of our plans for a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. And as a gift, as part of our reset, we're going to get rid of that missile defense system. And in exchange, we're going to ask for nothing. We're going to get nothing in exchange. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to sign a nuclear arms treaty with you. And we have 2,300 long-range nuclear weapons. You have 1,500. We're going to agree that no country can have more than 1,500. So you don't have to reduce anything. We, however, are going to reduce our nuclear weapon. We're going to give you these things and get nothing in return. And all that suggested to President Putin, in addition, by the way, to walking away from a red line in Syria, was that America was a nation that was weak and under leadership that would not stand up for our principles and values. And I think Putin has gone on to measure the man and to measure American foreign policy, and that was part of the calculation that led him to believe that when Ukraine was having tumult, that he could move into Crimea, take Sebastopol and parts of Crimea, and could do so without a threat from the United States. And the consequence of that, by the way, I don't think he's finished. I think Putin's objective is to try and reestablish, in some respects, the old Soviet empire. I mean, he looks at the world and says, you know, the Balkans, you could have, someone could invade us from there, they could invade us from Europe, they could come through the Caucasus, they could come from Uzbekistan. I mean, there are, and so we want to have buffers. And I think you'll see him move and take advantage of whatever propaganda pitch he has to try and move into various places in the world to strengthen what he sees as his borders. And it's a very different perspective than that which we have. And is threatening to global peace, to the prosperity of the globe, and to the interests of people all over the world. So I disagree with the president, and I think that at this stage he's been proven wrong on that front in terms of who is a geopolitical foe.
So is the logical inference of your argument that if you had been elected president, then maybe Putin wouldn't have tried to seize the Crimea? And if he had tried anyway, how would you have handled it differently than President Obama did?
You know, you can't always guarantee what the outcome is going to be, but you act with every resource you have to try and shape events. And I mean, you'll find this in your life, you'll find this in business, and you'll, of course, find it in foreign affairs. And that is when you sense that something might move against you in an important way, or where you see an opportunity. You say, okay, let's try and shape the events in such a way that things work out the way we'd like them to work out. That doesn't mean going in with tanks and bombers necessarily, hopefully never, but it means trying to shape things. So for instance, when Ukraine was seeing some tumult and Ukrainian leaders were pulling to the West, you had to recognize, and I'm sure the President of the United States has a lot of advisors. A lot of them are saying to him, foreign policy advisors are saying, you know, with Ukraine pulling towards the West, he's going to get nervous about Sebastopol, which is his naval port to the world. And you know, this could be a problem. He could get really nervous about that. And by the way, we are seeing some troops move towards that region, Russian troops. Now, anything like that should suggest that the President of the United States might want to talk to our allies immediately and say, by the way, what do you think about this? What do you want to do if Russia begins to go in that direction? And I'm sure our allies would say, you know, if he were to go that way, we'd put in place crippling sanctions against Russia. You might want to pick up the phone and call Mr. Putin, or you could ask Angela Merkel to do that, because she talks to him weekly, and say, let me tell you, we know you're looking at what's happening in Ukraine. We have some things to tell you. We're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO necessarily. We're going to make sure you get to keep Sebastopol. We're not going to let Sebastopol be taken away from you. We know how important that is. But don't you think about invasion, Mr. Putin, because if you do, these are the sanctions that the world would take against you, and recognize that we would not look upon this in any way kindly. Those kinds of communications, that kind of pre-effort might have led Putin not to take military action. You can't guarantee that, but at least you try. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing you're looking in Syria. When revolution began to erupt in Syria, you can stand back and sort of say, well, let's see what happens. And now 3.5 years later, hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of refugees, and an enormous opportunity for America missed. As you know, Syria is Iran's only key ally that gets them to the Mediterranean, and we could have had a very different setting in Syria had we, by the way, as Secretary Clinton suggested, if we had pulled together some of the moderate voices in Syria, made sure they were armed, and had them remove Assad. But we didn't do that. We missed the opportunity. Shaping events is key to foreign policy. And the president misunderstood Putin, misunderstood Russia, misunderstood the opportunity in Iran, misunderstood, in my opinion, the consequence of pulling our troops out of Iraq, misunderstood what was happening in the Arab world. One after the other misunderstood the events of the world, and the result is a world far more dangerous than when he took office 6.5 years ago.
So the other aspect of that quote that he was needling you on was the claim that Russia was the #1 geopolitical foe, and he said, "Oh no, Al-Qaeda is at that time." But regardless of what one would say in 2012, it's 2015. How would you rack and stack the threats? I mean, what is the most dire threat, and how would you?
Well, there's a difference between geopolitical and threat. So Russia was and continues to be the #1 geopolitical foe. That means, I mean, they're on the Security Council of the UN. They back various regimes in the world, some of the world's worst regimes. They are our geopolitical adversary. China has the strength to be so, but hasn't chosen to play that role. But Russia does. Russia is basically on the opposite side of the table from us in virtually every place where serious things are going on. And they continue to be our geopolitical adversary. Our greatest threat, as I said at the time, and by the way, even in the debate, I said, no, Russia's our geopolitical foe. The greatest threat to America is a nuclear Iran. Iran represents the greatest threat to America, and Iran is on the way to becoming the hegemon of the Middle East. That's their ambition. There are 5 capitals in the world now, 5 countries in the world where they call the shots or come close to calling the shots. And that was in Iran before they were nuclear. Iran nuclear will have even more sway in that region of the world. And that represents the greatest threat to the world, in my opinion. That would be #1. And so threat, Iran, and close thereafter in terms of threat, immediate threat to America is ISIS and the spread of radical violent jihadism in its various forms in the world. And on the other side, geopolitically, Russia's the geopolitical adversary, but not a military threat. We're not going to be at war with Russia anytime soon, and hopefully never. But geopolitically, they still push against us very hard.
So I want to talk about ISIL in a moment. Ironically, we're on the side with Iran, same side on ISIL.
Bad decisions make strange bedfellows.
But you mentioned you mentioned the nuclear challenge.
Yeah.
That obviously invites the question about the framework agreement that the president announced to great fanfare last week. How would you evaluate it? Would you support it? Would you have signed the letter that Senator Cotton sent to Rouhani, or maybe to the Khamenei, to the leader?
Yeah, what the Republican letter said, I agree with. They were right, which is it's better to walk away from a flimsy deal than to sign one just to try and get a deal done. There's no question in my mind, but that any deal with Iran will be celebrated by the mainstream media, will be seen by the public at large as being a success, whether it is or it's not. There'll be signing ceremonies, and Iran will look like that they're good guys now, and so forth, and everything will feel rosy for a while. I just happen to think that this deal is not as good as it should have been, not as good as it could have been. I would have given the president kudos. I told him that had he walked away, or in an op-ed rather, I wrote that had he walked away from the deal, that he deserved a profile in courage, because walking away from something which would be as politically attractive as any deal would be would take courage. But the deal that's been done is unfortunately not as tough as the deal we worked out with North Korea. The deal with North Korea said they had to dismantle their centrifuges. They had to eliminate their capacity to enrich uranium. And that was the deal, and as you know, they cheated to a certain degree, and to a real degree, and then ultimately, by the way, a nation can sign an agreement and then say, we're no longer going to abide by that agreement. And that's what North Korea did. They said, we're no longer living by that agreement, walked away, and then within a short period of time, they announced they had nuclear weapons. So that agreement, I mean, we have history here. That agreement did not prevent North Korea from having a nuclear weapon. And by the way, the fans of that agreement say, yes, but it slowed them down. If your only objective in Iran is to slow them down, then I'm sure this agreement has some prospects of slowing them down, or it may have that prospect. But if your objective is to eliminate the capacity of Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and thereby to threaten us and to threaten the region and to threaten the existence of our friends like Israel, then this agreement doesn't do the job. And so I'm very disappointed in it, and would look, what I would like to see happen is to see us pull back from the agreement, to have more crippling sanctions imposed on Iran, and reach a point where Iran comes to the bargaining table saying, please, we need relief. What do you need? And the answer is dismantle your 6,500 centrifuges, get the fissile material you have, and the enriched material, rather, that you have out of your country. And if you want nuclear power for peaceful purposes, that will be supplied to you by Russia or by others. But we're not going to have nations, you or anyone else, enriching uranium and thereby having the potential to create a nuclear holocaust.
So if the president does sign the deal, are you suggesting that the next president should then unsign the deal? What at that point, won't it be impossible to reassemble crippling sanctions because the rest of the world will have followed our lead on the deal, lift the sanctions? How would any president, get them back in place in 2017?
I do remember the old Yogi Berra line, which is, I'm not good at forecasting, particularly if the future's involved. Yeah. It's difficult to assess what the circumstances would be down the road when there's a new president, who that new president would be, what the composition of Congress would be.
I'm going to ask you that in a moment.
Right.
Yeah, okay,
what other nations would do. I can tell you what I would do if I were president now, and what I'd hope this president would do. I do believe that an agreement of this nature should be taken to Congress. And by the way, I'm not alone in that view. As I understand it, we have Mr. Schumer, Senator Schumer, who said, yes, actually, this should come before Congress. Republicans and Democrats both say an agreement of this nature should come before Congress. And we can have a debate as to whether that's required by the Constitution. What I do know is that during the Cold War, that agreements with Russia on nuclear weapons were brought by Republicans and by Democrats, Republican presidents, that is, and Democrat presidents, to Congress for their approval. Whether they had to or not constitutionally is another matter, but they did because they recognized the significance of it. And a nuclear Iran has significance for a lot of reasons. One is because they chant death to America every day. That does concentrate the mind. Two, of course, is that as they have said, Israel is a one atom bomb nation, a one-bomb nation, meaning they could be eliminated with one bomb, and they're our friend and ally in the region. Three is that if Iran is nuclear or has the capacity to become nuclear within a short period of time, meaning months to a year, then so would Saudi Arabia have to be, and Egypt, and Jordan, and ultimately Syria if they coalesce again, or ISIS. I mean, you think other people will become nuclear, and then finally, you will have fissile material ultimately falling into the hands of non-state actors like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other groups. And this is simply unacceptable. Not in the immediate future, but over the coming decade or two. It's simply unthinkable.
So you've mentioned ISIL a number of times there, ISIS. There's a case where Iran dislikes ISIL almost as much or more than we do. And they are arming groups inside Iraq to push ISIS back from Iraq. And they are doing so with some air cover from the U.S. Assets. So I take it you don't think that's a good idea. What is a better idea? How would you
Again, you go back to this notion of America through our foreign policy trying to shape events before very bad things happen or before options are eliminated. When the president backed away from the red line in Syria, we lost options. When the moderate voices in Syria were not coalesced and armed, and when ISIS or ISIL was established, we lost options. Mm-hmm. And so when the president did not put in place a status of forces agreement with Iraq and leave forces behind in Iraq, that opened up militarily an opportunity for ISIS to come rushing into Iraq, which it has done. When the president allowed Syria to be in tumult for 3 years, that opened a door for a group like either Al-Qaeda or ISIL or any other group to form and to be able to expand. And so we're now in this very awkward position where, not having taken the right action at the propitious time, we find ourselves with very poor options. And the poor option is, well, we don't like ISIS. We also don't like making Iran even more of a superpower in the region, and yet we're fighting alongside Iran. I mean, it's a very awkward and unfortunate situation, and perhaps we'll be able to thread the needle here and find a way to I mean, after having spent over $1 trillion and lost thousands and thousands of lives of Americans in Iraq, maybe we can get them to like us again and to have more influence in Iraq with their leadership. I hope so. But it's such a failure of foreign policy, given what we have done, what our men and women in uniform have done to earn freedom for a nation, to then be in such a position of weakness in that nation and in the region. It's really extraordinary.
So your response there reminds me a little bit of the responses I would get from my friends. This is when I was in the administration, and I'd 2005 to 7 say, okay, what should we do in Iraq? And they would say, don't invade Iraq. I'd say, okay, well, we've invaded Iraq, so now what should we do? And pressing for solutions now. So I just want to push you one more time. Let's stipulate that everything you said was correct, that this situation is much worse today because of choices that were made over the last 6 years and before. So both administrations. But certainly in the last 6 years, there were better choices that could have been made, but we are where we are now. So you're president of the United States now, 2015, and ISIL is threatening to take Mosul and Tikrit, and your only ground forces are Shia militia. Would you support them, or would you?
Well, the answer is getting rid of ISIS is our highest priority in that region of the world, and that means we're going to fight alongside whoever we have to fight alongside to absolutely defeat ISIS. What I'd like to see, and what I would try and do as President of the United States, is to see if we can't get other friends in the region to also participate in this effort, to also see if we can't work with Sunni leadership in Iraq to see if they can't, instead of a wink and a nod supporting ISIS, perhaps help us push against ISIS. You'll be working with the Kurds as well, and of course the Kurds have been very active in this effort. Bolster them, give them better equipment, give them better training, give them support from American military advisors, provide intelligence capacity to our friends, particularly those Sunnis in northern Iraq as well as the Kurds. Maybe get the Turks to see if they can't be more involved in this effort as well. Going back into Syria, what a mess. Who are our friends there? Who are the people we trust there? Hopefully we have some sense of that, and try and giving more support to the people who we think we have links with. So we're trying to get a larger force than just Iran, and see if we can't have also more influence with Iraq and the leadership in Iraq. I mean, all of these things you try and do, they're all chewing gum and baling wire. Because we are where we are, but nonetheless, you draw on every resource we have in the region, and of course, the region is in tumult. I mean, look what's happening in Yemen. I mean, you've got Iran looking like it's facing off against the Sunni world in Yemen, and a proxy war going on there. I mean, the president gave a speech at the beginning of his administration, went to Egypt about the new dimension of friendship that was going to exist in the world of Islam. My goodness, it hasn't worked out the way he promised. And so at this stage, you do the very best you can in every little capital you can to try and build something other than drawing Iran closer and closer to the leadership in Iraq.